hearing me. I'm- Can you hear me, Stan? Okay, well, I'm not very good at talking without stopping, so just keep turning it up until you hear crazy sounds. Okay, okay. Well, good morning. You guys look kind of like my lawn here. A little bit of green here and there, pretty scattered around. So I'll try to talk louder. Welcome to our morning Sunday school class, and today I want to emphasize this is an overview that we're doing of the Old Testament, so this is an overview of Judges, the book of Judges. And just out of curiosity, how many have ever read through the book of Judges? Or I should say, how many have not ever read through? What are the great stories in the book of Judges? Deborah, okay.
Gideon. Samson.
Okay, you got the big three, I would guess there. But there are a lot of stories in there and a lot of details. It's really a remarkable book, and it immediately follows in the Bible and in history. What does it follow?
Joshua.
Yeah, you can talk out loud. I have to, so you may too. Does anyone not have the outline? What? Here, keep your eye open if anybody else doesn't. Give the leftovers to me, please. So yes, this history book follows Joshua, where the nation of Israel finally, after 440 plus years, is finally in the land that God promised Abraham such a long time before. The dates of this are approximately 1350 to 1050, about 300-year period covered in the Judges, the book of Judges. There's discussion. It's not an easy book to date. One of the reasons is that there is some overlap. There's some back and forth. It's not all a straight chronology. He's just giving certain stories that occurred during this period of time. I've got to make sure my notes are in order here. So you all have this outline, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I need to give credit to Dale Ralph Davis for much of my view of the book, because most of the time when we read through the book of Judges, we just have a real, it's a real depressing book, a very depressing book. To see what happened during that period of time is very discouraging. But we need to keep in mind the underlying fact that God actually saves his people. In spite of themselves, he still cares for them and takes care of them. But he doesn't do this pleasantly and cleanly, because we do have to live through the consequences of our behaviors, and that certainly is true for them. Okay. Okay, I guess we will continue on at this point to keep her in our prayers. She is showing signs of her age. And we all will be going through that one way or another. Some of us more dramatically than others. Okay, so you have your outline there, and I will, this is a good outline. I'm going to use some other words for titles, but that is a very good outline. I'm not going to go into details regarding a lot of these things because this is an overview. One way of describing Judges is incomplete obedience. Joshua is famous for being very devoted to God and being careful to do exactly what he said. There's some things that he missed in his life, but he did a good job of getting the people across the Jordan and defeating all of the existing powers in the land of Canaan. That is their possession. The land was divided up then, allotted to the various tribes, and it was the responsibility of each tribe to finish cleaning up each of their territories. But Judges is a book of incomplete obedience. The judges were primarily military and judicial leaders of the nation, not really much on spiritual leadership, as you will see when you read through that. I do like the theme that this is a book that shows that Yahweh saves his people. Samson, just at the end of his life, said, when in his last prayer, he said, just before his last prayer, he said, "You have given us this great deliverance," referring to one of his victories, and that really is a good thing to keep in mind. God is keeping them through this bad period of history. The theme verses is, the theme verses, same words, is not found until the end of the book. Chapter 21 and 25 also stated earlier in 17:6. Does anyone know what that is?
In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
That's right. Isn't that kind of an odd comment? Because we haven't had any kings in Israel yet in Judges. This precedes the time of Saul and David and Solomon. So why would they say that?
There's no king.
Yeah, well, that's a foreign concept to them because they haven't had one yet.
Okay.
But they do. God is to be their king. And they are just discounted that because once they got into the land, I guess they felt like they could do things on their own. So we have this comment that there was no king in Israel, and so everybody was doing whatever they thought was right. Does that sound like a familiar theme? We even have mottos, we have songs, we have all kinds of things in our day promoting do your own thing. If it feels good, do it. Do what is right in your own heart. Follow your heart. That's the theme. Follow your heart. Well, following our heart is a good picture of what Judges is about. So let's pay attention to that. So the general outline for the book is you have defeat. That's shown in chapter 1 and repeated in chapters 2 and into 3. Then you have a disobedient phase where they took over their property. Each family tried to go into their allotted land, and they had a certain amount of victory, but they didn't follow instructions completely. They left people there. So they didn't drive them out completely. And then, of course, the last chapters, the last 4 chapters, is the most puzzling and confusing section maybe of the whole Bible, where there is just great disgrace, great confusion, great idolatry, immorality, all kinds of terrible stuff that happened. So we have defeat, disobedience, and disgrace. So this is the nation of people that are in their land. They have been saved from slavery in Egypt many years before. Not these people, but their parents and their grandparents. They lived in slavery for hundreds of years in Egypt, and they cried out finally and begged God, and God delivered them and brought them with some missteps all the way into their promised land that God had promised close to 800 years before, 700 years before. So now they are in the land, and they seem to have forgotten a lot of their lessons that they've learned. These people had been saved, miraculously preserved, I should say, for 40 years in the desert, being fed by God, being given water by God, just miraculous protection and provision all through those years. And now that they went into the land, and these people and their parents had gone through the entire land, defeated all the big, mighty powers. And these were pretty much all miraculous victories, because the nation wasn't that good. They weren't that great at a lot of things. They didn't grow up as in a military culture. But these people, parents, had been trained and had gone through all that period, which really didn't last too long. Joshua was 80 years old when they entered the land, and he died at what age? You guys didn't do your homework very well. So he lived to 110, so it was about 30 years. And if we figure that the people that, yes, sir.
Would you mind if I gave an update on Joe, since everyone's probably curious?
Thank you, that would be very wise, thank you.
Her blood pressure was a little high, and her heart rate was a little high, but nothing extreme. Her symptoms are consistent with previous times when she's had a UTI. So she's going to the hospital, and it seems likely that's what it is, but obviously they'll figure it all out there. But
Hopefully they'll fix it.
Katrina's taking her to Payson Hospital, and that's what's
Okay.
happening. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Can I ask a quick question? Do we know where the wheelchair went? It's usually here?
Wayne's car. And when we loaded it up last week after the baptism, he asked if anyone else needed it. We said, no, just bring it back next Sunday. So
Okay, well, at least they didn't sell it.
it was, yeah. Yeah, so anyway.
Yeah, we've got to take these things more seriously. There's more of us getting in that direction. Thanks, Stan. Sorry I didn't respond better, but the fact that the wheelchair wasn't here didn't help any. Yeah. Okay. Okay, going back to the judges. The Judges is about a flawed people, and we got to remember, whenever you read Judges and all this confusing, strange things, you've got to remember that this is about their flawless God who is forever faithful to his word and to his covenant. And he does this by means of his infinite power and his constant, in their case, visible presence. They had the Ark of the Covenant there. We have not seen any evidence up until Ezekiel that God's presence actually left the temple, the tabernacle in this case. So he is always there, and he is available to them to talk to them. And through Judges, you'll see that they talk to him occasionally, and he talks back. He gives them answers. He tells them what to do. But they just don't do it thoroughly. And that is where the theme of the problem here is to doing things my way and not God's way. So one of the things we want to notice that when Moses died, what happened to the people?
Went downhill faster?
Pardon?
Went downhill faster?
When Moses died, Joshua took over, and they followed. They paid attention. God did miraculous things through Joshua, and that gave those people respect for him. Joshua was at least 40 years older than everybody else, a minimum of 40 years older than everyone else except Caleb. So they were a younger generation, and we can see what happens to our younger generations if we don't keep them, train them, and teach them all the things that we know. When Joshua died, this is what happened. They didn't get a single leader, but God was still their leader. They still had the priests. They still could talk. You'll see conversations in here. What shall we do? Well, God said they were each to go into their own possession, designated properties throughout this whole country. And they had just won all these victories. They knew that with God, they could take over these places. So as we go through, we'll see that they did that. They attempted to go into their land, and they did go into their properties. They had a certain amount of victories, but in every case, as you go through there, you will see that looking for this comment that repeats over and over, they could not drive out all of the people. And so they persisted to live in the land. So what was the other thing that they were instructed to do back in Exodus before they ever got there? They were to destroy the idols. And I guess these things are just too pretty. They're worth too much. They're gold and silver. And they didn't get rid of those things. And that was one of the primary things they actually coveted. And the lesson of Achan didn't stick with them. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. You said they were unable to drive out the peoples of the land, or my Bible says they did not drive out.
Right, they did not.
Okay.
I mean, they defeated, with Joshua, they defeated everyone. They knocked down the major powers, but the people themselves were still living in there, in their groups. And the instruction of Moses and of Joshua was to go now and take possession of your land. And that included driving out completely those people and destroying all their idols. And they weren't able, they didn't. This was the failure of the second generation, but they could not. And so the big question for us all is, why couldn't they?
It's hard for people who love the world to walk away from the things of the world.
And it's really hard for us to follow God completely to the details, because some of what he asks us to do is hard. But yes, again, especially when it means getting rid of stuff we like. So even though Joshua died, did God die? Did anything of God die? Was his power still there? Was it available? Would he lead them? Did he promise to be with them, or were they supposed to do all of this on their own strength? We sure like to think so in a hurry. So, the funny thing is, or the sad thing is that, God works in various ways. When Joshua died, he did not give them a single human leader to take over. That happened begrudgingly, but willingly, several hundred years later, and so no one answered my question, why do they keep saying there was no king in Israel? Probably because this was written I don't know how probably, but one reasonable guess is that Samuel wrote this history down. And that was at the time of the kings, and there was a king in Israel when this was being written, and that's why he put that. That's the context for him saying that at that time there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes, which is always a recipe for serious disaster. So even after they did have kings, though, that didn't work out perfectly either. That wasn't the solution, even though God gave them kings and gave them a permanent king now in the family of David. Even after David died and Solomon died and on and on and on, the nation went into a mess, but God was still taking care of them. Again, that's the big theme we want to remember about Judges. Whenever you think about that, even though they messed up so bad, God was still taking care of them. God was still preserving them. He was still leading them and teaching them through painful lessons. Right up, we see that happening all the way through the kings. And when they finally get dispersed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, through that 400-year period of silence from God, they were still there. They were still doing their thing the way they were taught, with some serious failings, but they were still trying to follow God in some fashion. When Jesus appeared on the scene, there was still a very detailed, constructed system of Jewishness, of following the law to some degree or another. So God is faithful to his people, and he will stay that way through history and eternity because he said so. It's for his glory and honor that he deals with mankind, and Israel in particularly, and to us also. So, getting now to the book itself, the first part, the first section of defeat, the failure of the second generation, that's detailed in a bit of a fashion between chapters 1:1 up through 3:6, and we have this repeated comment that they tried, but they didn't succeed perfectly. There was some success, as we see in verse 4. Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands. Then you have this story, this gruesome story about cutting off guys' thumbs and toes, big toes. It's what they did in those days to humble people, to keep them,
Unbalanced.
yeah, off balance.
Keep
Exactly.
on their remaining toes.
Yeah. Verse 10, Judah went up against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron, and they struck down 3 big guys. They went, so we have the story of Caleb and his sons and sons-in-laws. Verse 17, Judah went with Simeon. So here's, if you look at a map of the dispersion of the tribes through the land, Simeon and Levi, because of the actual guys, Simeon the son of Jacob and Levi the son of Jacob, because they went and wiped out the city of, just went out of my head, Shechem. God gave them a sentence that they would be dispersed in Israel. They would not have their own specific land like some of the others. And so Simeon is scattered throughout Judah for the most part. Levi, because of one of the sons of Levi, he did a dramatic thing in protecting God's honor at the time of Balaam and the sins of Peor, that God gave him a special blessing, and his dispersion as the priests, the priestly family, they are dispersed through Israel, but they are dispersed specifically with God honoring jobs of being the priests, of taking care of the altars, of managing and running the cities of refuge. But the rest of these people are in specific properties. Their boundaries are defined, and that's the property that they are to own, and that is still, we still expect that, at least some of us still expect that to be restored in the end times.
The other people are wrong, right?
Pardon?
And the other people are wrong, right?
Yeah, they can disagree with us, but they would be wrong, yes. So what are the things we mentioned before that contained all these fertile seeds of failure as they were trying to capture their own land?
You want to look around their own eyes?
That's one big thing,
Lacking faith.
apparently so.
They kept forsaking God, they kept forsaking His word. In different times, as they forsook the Lord, and they forsook the Lord,
And what did they do instead?
following the ways of
Their heart?
Yes, they collected the idols. They kept them around, and the worst part of it, okay, I shouldn't say worst, who knows. Another bad thing they did was by leaving their enemies living in the land, then they were affected by their customs, by their idolatry, and it got to the point where they were giving sons and daughters in exchange, for marriage. Yes, sir.
One thing that sticks out to me is they don't learn from their past experiences very good.
So, excuse me. Said after Joshua died and then the elders died, that was when they went off the edge. The generations that hadn't seen them conquering Canaan, because they had the Canaanites still living amongst them. They were, in other words, you forget your history, like Logan said, and you're going to go in some bad directions, particularly when you're talking about God, right?
They didn't fight the wars that Joshua and they did, just like here in America. We didn't fight for what we have. We've forgotten what others have fought for us. We don't realize how much we take it for granted, or the blessings that from them, that we're still, even though it's a kind of like fumes, but still, people still want to come here because of the blessings of those that fought, just like back then. The wars that Joshua and they fought, they didn't fight like they were young, they were too young, but they didn't fight for what they had.
Yes, when you,
They forgot what God said. They kept forsaking.
sounds like we're a fallen people. We have a problem of remembering our history and believing it and remember and live our lives on the principles that went before us, the principles that we should know and remember, but we think we can rewrite the books, we can rewrite the rules. I'm saying we, but we're supposed to be talking about them, not about us. We wouldn't do anything like that.
Jerry, I'm curious, would you say it was a failure of Joshua and the other leaders in Israel not to establish another Joshua-type leader? You mentioned it earlier, Moses had Joshua, and that transition seemed to flow, and then Joshua did not have a next person, and then we get the book of Judges. So do you see that as a failure of Joshua, or was that the plan of God?
Well, it was,
Yes.
yes. There you go.
Or the desire of God, I should say.
Well, the desire of God was for each person to follow. But at the same time, he gives us leaders. There were always leaders of each family. All through the time of Moses and Joshua, there were always the leaders. He couldn't collect 600,000 people and talk to them. You have to have delegates. And that's how it was practiced all the way up through. So when they got into the land, God's explicit instruction were for each family to go and possess and clean up and live in their land, their given sections. So there were leaders, and there should have been leaders, but there probably were leaders. We just naturally do that. We want to follow somebody. Some people like to be the leader, and the rest of us are happy to let them lead. But obviously the leaders have to be vetted, they have to be qualified, they have to be trained. And that's where, yes, we would have to conclude that that did not happen. And the baby boomers are an example. See, we went through that war, and the children that were born after that war were not raised the way the fighters were. The fighters had gone through the Depression, raised their children to be hardy and tough and not whiners. And so when the war was over, you know, when all that pressure goes away, what's the first thing we want to do? I should demonstrate, but I won't. But, you know, we want to sit down and put our feet up. We want to make it easy. We don't want our kids to have to go through that. And so we spoil them, and we don't teach them. And we don't require of them the same degree of stress that taught us our lessons. So yeah, there's an obvious break here between Joshua and Judges. I mean, that's the point of the book of Judges, is all of this training, devotion has to be passed on from us to our children, to even the grandchildren, because generally parents we do get this, most of us do get to see our grandchildren and to have a relationship with them. And that has to be passed on, and the goal of life isn't to ease. People complain about me working too much and not resting enough. I say, well, that's what death is for. Death is for resting. So, and we need to have an attitude like that towards our life, because we lose sight of the real battle, the real unseen battle. Because just like in the book here, where the people defeated but not eradicate the enemy. We, of course, don't have the power to eradicate our enemies, our spiritual forces, but we are equipped to deal with them. We are equipped to oppose them. The fact that we can't see them is probably a good thing, because then there would be other issues. But here they could see their enemies, and once you defeat your enemy, you've got to figure out what to do with them. It's just, we could talk about this for a long time. I need to move on. But we need to not view our enemies as our friends. We cannot follow their deadly practices. So we can make a lot of comments and apply that to our own world, our own country, our own culture today, but you're smart enough to figure out that. So God does say that he left these enemies and didn't drive them out to test them. And God does that for us, doesn't he? He leaves tests. We don't need to beat that up. This is a summary, an overview. So God's instructions back in Joshua was to completely, Joshua 23, 6 through 8 was to destroy them or chase them out, because the people could migrate away and live somewhere else out of the land. God had given them the land. And this was really public knowledge, because the inhabitants at the time, we can see from Rahab's testimonies that they knew about what God was doing with Israel, that they were coming and that they were undefeatable. So they could have driven those people out. They didn't have to kill them all. They could migrate out. That was their option. They were bad people. They deserved judgment, and those were their two choices. But the Israelis had to follow through and make that happen. And of course, that's what did not happen, and so they became snares and stumbling blocks for them, and especially the fact of their gods. Exodus 20, verse 4 is very explicit. You shall not make any graven images. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So the second part of Judges 3 through 16 is a record of failures. Failures one after another, and they all involve accepting the idols, accepting the practices of the inhabitants of Canaan, and taking their daughter, the Canaanites' daughters for wives who brought along their idols and giving their daughters to the Canaanites where they became corrupted. And this became a very homogeneous thing throughout the entire country. And so this was all it was. There was just idol worship everywhere. There was idolatry everywhere. And so it was a most amazing, miraculous act of God to bring up these guys that are labeled judges. And so that is where we are in chapters 3 through 16. And in those chapters, you have this long list of judges. Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and of course, don't forget Samson. So, who did God tell Moses that he was and what he was like? We all should have this memorized. I haven't memorized it. But when God, Moses asked, well, can I see you? Can I see you? And God said, well, you stay there or you won't get fried, and I'll go pass in front of you. And as he did that, he said, I am Yahweh, Yahweh God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. That's God's nature. That's the nature that we need to think of God as. If we think of God as an angry God, it's because we are focusing on our sins and our failures instead of the character of our gracious God and Savior who gave us Jesus to give us righteousness, gave us Jesus to be beat up, bludgeoned, and strung up on nailed to a tree to die for us. This is the God of love, and that's how we need to remember to think of him. In our messy situations, we need to remember that because he is loving. And this is what the book of Judges is for, to show us that as bad as people get, if he has made a promise, he's going to follow through. He's going to do something about it. So we have these 12 judges operating through these few chapters in the Bible to remind us that God is loving and he's going to deliver us. Of course, it would be fine if we avoided that by not becoming messy and terrible, but that happens to us sometimes also. So does anyone have any comments they want to make about these judges and things that you learned from them? Or, because we've all read through this countless times, and we've all shaken our head and yeah.
And even in that verse that you just said, where I am the Lord, not he, excuse me, God tells even what he's doing in Judges, that he's compassionate to 1,000 to 1,000 generations to those who love him.
Yep.
And the wickedness only to the third and fourth. Even right there, what he's showing in Judges, that he, thank God, his mercy, that he doesn't, just like what it shows in Judges when he said, when they forsake him, then God brings the discipline through other nations. And another nation or something, they cry out to God, because that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to, they're getting spanked, they're being disciplined through the enemies because they forsake the Lord. And then God is merciful and he comes in and brings a judge, and it's us.
Yes, he is,
Merciful.
yes, he is merciful. We don't get mercy elsewhere, but God is merciful. Again, we see the problem here, and always at the end of, just before God sends a judge, they are crying out to him. They are in pain, and God hears and knows that pain and agony they're in, and he responds in compassion. But what we don't see in Judges is they don't repent and turn. They just accept the deliverance and go on their way, and as soon as that guy is not there to keep them sort of in line, they immediately go back and worship the idols. It's just an amazing thing.
With those really nasty stories at the end of the book of just really sick and depraved behavior, what is a Christian today supposed to get out of his or her quiet time when reading through stuff like that?
Okay, this is the third section of Judges, back in the last chapter 17 and 18. There are two different sections here within the last section. 17 and 18 is just so sad. The making of gods. So we have here in chapter 17 a guy and his mom who decide, I don't follow the reasoning here, but I didn't live back then, so I'm sure it was reasonable. But they had this money, and she just thought it was a good idea to make a god directly, just specifically against the simplest, one of the most simple statements in the Bible is Exodus 20, chapter 4, don't make any carved or molded images of anything on earth to worship. And that's exactly what they did. Let's make some of each. Let's make a carved one and a molded one. And let's set this up. So then they didn't stop there. They made a shrine, a place of worship. They had the tools, the ephod, and they even just out of the blue yanked up somebody, said, "You're our priest, so you're managing this." It's all this human arbitrary stuff that we're doing. And there is no one to stop us from doing it. Thankfully, for us, the Spirit of God lives in us, and he puts a finger on that, I would say typically, certainly has for me, really quickly, and does not permit us to get that depraved as we are shown through here. And the last chapters there are where we get that verse, two verses at the beginning in chapter, I cannot read my own notes. So verse 7 of chapter 17, every man, there was no king, and every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. We're just flying by the seat of our pants, as the phrase is. We are doing what we think is right. And the thing we need to remember there is that we do have a king. And thankfully for us, he owns us. And he's very careful to deal with our consciences, at least if we let him. I know we we can be really blockheaded and dull his touch on us. But if the Spirit of God is living in us, even though we are groaning within ourselves because of the mess that we are, as Paul says, and as God still will deal with us, and all we need to do is bow before him. He's always around us and with us. There is no reason for us to resist him. And we have all these cloud of witnesses around us. We have the fellowship of the believers. We have the word. We do not have to be anything like the nation of Israel during the time of the judges, because we have God living in us. They had God's presence to look at and follow, but the foolishness of man, the depravity of man is just, you cannot say too much about that. And I did not get everything said that I wanted to say, and I didn't say it correctly, but there is a lot to learn from here. And the final thing is to remember that it is God who is the God over all of the confusion and ugliness of our own day. He is still God, compassionate and gracious and slow to anger. He is God alone. As Peter said in chapter 1 Peter 4:17, it is now in our country, in our culture, time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it does begin with us, then what's going to become of those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? So those of us who do suffer, and we believe suffering is coming, we need to suffer in accordance with God's will for us. And we entrust our souls to the faithful Creator in doing what is right. Thanks for putting up with my talking. I hope I was loud enough. And again, it's a confusing, puzzling book, has been all my life. But the bottom line is, God is all through it, trying to pull them back all the time, every time, over and over and over and over. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, just tell Mom that Judges has got to be like every little boy's favorite book, because there's all kinds of blood and killing and murders and jawbones of donkeys and whatnot. But as you mentioned, God is all throughout there, and even though it does seem very dark and grim at times, I think one of my favorite chapters is chapter 13, where we actually see Jesus in Judges. God appeared before Noah and his wife, and that's just a really cool story that is worth checking out.
Well, it is. There's so many things, little details in there. There are a couple of things I didn't mean to say, and I will take another minute to do that. You know, when Samson pulled down the house, he likely destroyed the entire government of the Philistines, because all of the high-ups were there, the whole cabinet. I mean, it was just amazing. You know, most of these judges got conquered, got rid of their top general and leaders like that, but Samson did a real house cleaning. Really an amazing thing. And there's a lot of things, about what we do here. The biggest thing I see that's so bad in our culture is that we totally ignore the aged, we totally ignore experience, we totally ignore the lessons learned from our, haven't even been a country for 300 years yet, and we're just working really, really hard to just flush all the lessons learned, all the methods, and certainly our spiritual heritage. America was settled by people getting away from religious persecution, and although the country itself wasn't set up Christian by any means, but it was a haven for believers of all kinds, even odd ones,
Like us.
like us. Thank you for saying us. Like me, but like us. Thank you for your time. And I hope everyone does have one of the outlines. He did a really good job on these outlines.